after that. So take it away.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me today. I'm also the author of the person I'm going to be speaking about, A Failure Vision, Michael Harrington and the Limits of Democratic Socialism, which is the latest book on the founder of DSA. And a shameless plug, I urge you to buy it because I'm going to be glossing over a lot of things just to kind of get at the essence of my talk. So Michael, I want to just start off with who Michael Harrington is. He is the founder of the Democratic Socialists of America, and he was actually the head of the Socialist Party of America and the founder of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. And he was also a public intellectual, author of many books, most notably The Other America, which was a seminal work on poverty. And he also developed this theory called realignment. And I want to talk to you now a little about what realignment is. It is not something that he envisioned or originally invented, that actually came from other people he was associated with, but it's something he truly developed and refined into a strategy. And realignment was meant to answer the question, how can the United States reach socialism? And Harrington begins with this idea that in Western Europe, the working class has some form of independent political representation in a social democratic or a labor party. The Labour Party in Britain, the Socialist Party of France, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, well, what about the United States? And he believes that actually there is no mass socialist party here. And he's writing this and developing these ideas in the late 50s, early 60s. And he's like, well, yeah, we don't have a mass labor party, but we actually have a secret labor party. And that is formed by the trade unions, the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the AFL-CIO, when they were forged and united in 1955. So he believes people like Samuel Gompers, George Meany, notable labor bureaucrats and anti-communists were actually like these secret socialists pushing a progressive agenda, but they happen to be subsumed in the Democratic Party. And he believes also that after World War II, that there was this new class of technicians and professionals, and that they had the potential to be part of a new majority coalition. And Harrington looked to this new class, the labor bureaucracy, and the civil rights movement, that they would form a new majority that could transform America. But he believed that these elements of the new majority found their political expression in the Democratic Party. But the Democratic Party was controlled by racists and capitalists. So what Harrington wanted to do was to realign or transform the Democratic Party. And he's very insistent that this is the only place where a political beginning can happen. So what does that mean? Well, it means taking all the racists and the capitalists from the Democratic Party, moving them to the Republican Party, and therefore the Democratic Party becomes basically the equivalent to the British Labour Party or Swedish Social Democracy. And now that the parties have been transformed, the Democrats will institute a welfare state, and from that you will eventually get socialism. And how does he envision this happening aside from just a pious wish? Well, he believes that socialists and social democrats need to be inside the Democratic Party as an active constituency. They need to ally with liberals because he believes that the first step in realignment will be a new reinvigorated liberalism. But socialists, and this is, Harrington believes that socialists need to be strategic and realistic. He calls this the left wing of realism. So that means you can't alienate liberals, you can't do a lot of militant things in the streets, anything illegal. You got to stay strictly within legality and all of that. You really can't, be pro-communist in any sense. So anti-communism you have to accept. And all this anti-imperialism, that's kind of, well, you can't do that either because, again, this will alienate your liberal allies. So this is the basic vision of realignment, is to take these the progressive constituency, he says, that exists in the Democratic Party, make it the ruling faction of the Democratic Party, and that will lead to socialism. And Harrington, this is pretty much his political vision throughout his life. And I just want to now briefly kind of talk about how that actually worked. So this was actually, if you are a student of the 60s, you're no doubt familiar with Students for Democratic Society and the Pruitt-Huron Statement. You'll find the realignment vision there. And in 1964, Harrington first really put this into action with his support for Lyndon Baines Johnson in his election campaign. And he basically said, we need to support Johnson. We got to be realistic. It's not just the lesser evil, because obviously the Republicans are ultra right, they're racist, they're going to start a war, they might even start World War III. But if we support the Democrats, they're a bit more peace loving, they'll fight poverty, and they'll give the left space to organize. And he was right in a sense, because there was obviously there was a war when from Johnson, who also did fight poverty. Kind of. But the other part of this is there was in 1964 a semi-expression of this new majority, and this was the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was basically an action by civil rights activists in Mississippi to create an integrated, non-racist Democratic Party, because the state party itself was segregated. And they did voting drives in Freedom Summer in 1964. There was killings by the Klan, by the cops. And at the Democratic Convention that year, the Mississippi Freedom Party wanted their delegates seated because they, correctly assumed that they represented the majority. And they, the civil rights activists have been supported by labor unions, et cetera, and students as well. But the Democratic Party establishment gave them 2 seats and said, no, you got to get in line. And Harrington's comrades who were at the Democratic Convention, notably Bayard Rustin, said, you have to accept this compromise. No, we're not going to embarrass our Democratic Party allies. And Harrington, even though he wasn't there, he fully accepted that. So you get the election of Johnson in 1964, which again leads to the Vietnam War, etc. And Harrington is aghast at this, thinking that Johnson is just led astray. And in 1968, Harrington was looking very favorably on Robert F. Kennedy as an expression of realignment. Kennedy is killed. He supports pretty much every other Democratic candidate. He just lines up with Hubert Humphrey, even though he supports the war, but he's not Nixon. So there you go. I'm going to skip over 1972 because Harrington was involved in probably the weirdest political split on the American left, when the Socialist Party was torn between supporting either George McGovern or Richard Nixon. And I will take you to after he leaves the Socialist Party in the mid-70s. He's involved in trying to transform the Democratic Party platform, and he pushes something called the Democratic Agenda, which is basically this kind of left liberal platform of like a reinvigorated New Deal and Great Society, a new welfare state, and it actually does get approved in the Democratic Party, and it is championed by Jimmy Carter, the party's nominee in 1976. And Harrington sees this great class struggle at the ballot box in 1976. The corporate class is for Gerald Ford, but the working class is for Jimmy Carter. So he really believes that this is a working class victory when Jimmy Carter is elected. And what happens when Jimmy Carter is elected? Well, that Democratic agenda ends up just being a meaningless piece of paper as Carter attacks unions, institutes what we would call Reaganism, kind of like these first springs. And Harrington himself is again aghast and upset at this. He's involved in this toothless coalition called the Progressive Alliance, which just wants the Democrats to be nicer to them. It's, basically labor bureaucrats and progressive activists. So we have that. And another instance happens in the 1980s. And this is actually probably the most substantial attempt at realignment in Harrington's lifetime. And this is called the Rainbow Coalition, led by Jesse Jackson. And the Rainbow Coalition includes civil rights activists, it includes labor unions, a lot of people who had come out of the new communist movement but were now social democrats were involved with this. And Jackson's campaign involved things that Harrington, or it involved basically a more robust pushing of like social welfare and a policy that was opposed to, say, interventions in Central America and the recognition of Palestine. And I should add that Jackson, even though he doesn't call himself a socialist, he's actually within the confines of the Democratic Party. He's far more left than, say, Bernie Sanders, since Jackson doesn't have a history of militarism. So this is this major attempt at realignment, or this kind of new majority. And Harrington, who at this point is leader of DSA in 1984, does not support it. He supports the lead of the AFL-CIO bureaucracy, which is supporting the campaign of Walter Mondale.
You have 5 minutes left.
Okay. So in 1988, there is another attempt at the Rainbow Coalition. Harrington supports it because Jackson has kind of moderated himself, but again, Jackson is defeated and Harrington is excited about the possibilities for the left under Michael Dukakis. He's the only one in the world who's excited at those possibilities. Now, Harrington dies in 1989, and Realignment actually is formally abandoned by DSA in the 90s. But since DSA is, the largest nominal socialist organization in the United States, that it still finds expression today in DSA with something called the Surrogate Party and the Dirty Break, which is basically we build up our forces in the Democratic Party, and theoretically at some point we will break from the party. But now to conclude this, just because I want to give time for the other speakers in discussion, is Realignment. It presents itself as this serious strategic strategy. It's 33rd dimensional chess, when really it amounts to voting harder for the Democrats. There is nothing there. It is complete hot air, and it fails for a number of reasons. The Democrats are not an arena of struggle for socialists or communists. They are a bourgeois imperialist party controlled lock, stock, and barrel by the class enemies of the working class. Furthermore, liberals are not allies of socialists and communists. They are enemies. And you will never get socialism or communism by working through the Democratic Party. You will train activists to act as foot soldiers for their enemies to enact their agenda. And my short, very quick summation here would be that Realignment and any effort to work inside the Democratic Party means sacrificing political independence of the working class. That should be that is something that we must utterly reject, and that we should build our own organizations of struggle, and that we should recognize this state cannot be reformed, and that the Democratic Party are our enemies, and that the only result of this will be to continue a legacy of failure and to foreclose the possibilities for socialism in the United States. Thank you.
Okay, Atlee will be next.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone who put this conference together. I know how much work it has been. I hope everybody who put the most effort into it gets a nice little break after this, because you all deserve it. And also thank you for the last panel and whoever is DJing, because I really enjoy starting with Dead Prez and going into low key. So thank you. So just to give a brief introduction, since I know no one here knows who I am, just one thing to understand for me, right? I was raised on my grandmother's stories of growing up in Hitler's Germany. And so my orientation to politics is very much still centered around the German experience and the failures of the German left against the Nazis. I would be rather centric in that regards to a fault, and I'll just start with that so you know my biases going into things. And that's really how I came to Michael Harrington in the first place. I want to give a little continuity from where what you're talking about, Doug, is how Michael Harrington did or did not understand his own politics in relation to the social democracy that failed against the Nazis in Germany. And it's really interesting. I'll talk about three instances as well. So back in 1968, and I don't know much about Harrington's background. I really didn't know much about him or the DSA in general before I started reading about him, even though I became a member of the DSA and still am technically. So in 1968, right, there's really no evidence that he is familiar with the German social democracy against the Nazis, right? But the entirety of his belief in the democratic left, or toward a democratic left, or whatever he called it in the book that year, was, of course, the idea that a unified revolutionary working class was impossible. And this cross-class alliance that you're talking about, Doug, right? Harrington explicitly referred to it as a new middle class. And there's really no evidence that he understood that in this kind of realignment around the new middle class, he was actually reframing or rebranding a more conservative version of the social democratic politics in Germany at that time, right? And what is most interesting about this is by the time we get to 1976 in his book, The Twilight of Capitalism, he advances actually a pretty staunch criticism of the electoral path to socialism, at least as it was articulated by those like Karl Kautsky, Rudolf Hilferding, and Edward Bernstein of the German Social Democratic Party, or the SPD, right? It was really strange to me because at this point, he's already criticizing the electoral path to socialism to such an extent. And to me, I've laughed out loud. The literal title of his chapter in 1976, where he advanced the criticism, he called it bourgeois socialism. So to me, and this is the thing that I still can't figure out, Doug, maybe you can, it's how you can have somebody, at least at a theoretical level, who's already coming to criticisms of these things, but at the same time, there is no connection, an entire disconnect between what he was advancing at the theoretical level, at least in this one instance, looking at Germany and then building a politic that's actually the same in so many ways, if not obviously more conservative. And by 1989, Socialism, Past and Future, which is his last book, he reiterated his criticisms of Kautsky and Hilferding and the electoral path to socialism of the SPD. And unfortunately, he then ended his last book looking to SPD leader Edward Bernstein on the new middle class again, which, and I get the only way that I can understand it, trying to reconcile theoretically in my head this fundamental disconnect that existed throughout Michael Harrington, is ultimately like a left form of American exceptionalism, which I definitely think exists throughout liberal, progressive, and the democratic socialist left today. And so to bring a little background to this in terms of German social democracy, to sort of relate it back to the United States more broadly, right? Centered to the idea of people like Karl Kautsky and Rudolf Hilferding and Edward Bernstein, was the idea that, in this case, the Weimar Republic, the state in general, through the electoral path to socialism was through a regulation of capitalism or a management of capitalism in this era of post-capitalist crisis, right? This was their belief that the state could be relied on for the path to socialism as a way of lifting up the working class into what was then a new middle class to them as well, right? It was sort of a project to universalize this notion of a new middle class. And to me, what's most interesting about that not only is the relationship to how Michael Harrington saw it as well, but also this was the dominant form of the SPD's anti-fascist politics as well, because the entire idea was centered on universalizing this new middle class through the power of the government and the electoral inexorable march from capitalism to socialism was going to be the means of keeping the Nazis at bay, to stop them from rising in their influence throughout the country. Sorry, noting the chat. And so what was paradoxical for the German SPD at the time was the fact that this very idea, this very new middle class that they looked to, that they put their hope in universalizing as this this pseudo anti-fascist politics, was that ultimately the middle class in Germany then had, at least in large part, been the product of German settler colonial expansion into the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. However, right, and so for people like Rudolf Hilferding and Karl Kautsky, they actually believed that colonialism was a natural extension or an inevitable extension of capitalism itself. So the idea for them was that in a sense, or in essence, to the colonized people in Africa, you are now being part, you have the privilege of being part of this process where you go from colonized person to working class on the path of potential socialism, presumably through your control over the settler colonial state in Africa, right? This was not a side aspect of their politics. It was part of the essence of their politics. And the Weimar Republic was the means by which this process was going to happen. But unfortunately, right, what do we know about after the end of World War I? As a result of Germany losing the war, they also lost control of their settler colonies. So the expropriation of surplus value into Germany from the settler colonies, right? The part of the condition for the rise of the new middle class in general had evaporated. And so over the course of the Weimar years, from the end of 1918 to, late 1932 and the first quarter of 1933, what you saw is a fundamental disconnect between German social democratic politics and what they hoped to achieve their successes and the actual conditions of Germany in general. Because far from being capable of giving rise to this universal new middle class, situations of crisis, both capitalist crisis and their losing the benefit of the settler colonies, had created a crisis of worsening the middle class that the SPD was supposed to be universalizing. And so this brings us back to the United States today, right? It is, to me, it is no coincidence that Bernie Sanders, for example, this is not a personal attack, right? This is just reality, right? That he and his wife became millionaires for the first time after his book comes out, advancing the centering progressive politics in his democratic socialist politics on reversing this decline of the middle class, right? It is the same sort of project, except it's modified because the United States is not Weimar Germany, right? The United States doesn't exist as a settler colonial power in the exact same way that Germany does. It has its own history, its own settler colonial nature that is different yet very much related to Germany at the same time. Similarly, the problem for contemporary social democracy in the United States today, trying to universalize this notion of the middle class, is it is similarly based on an impossible fiction. And this is really important to me because you can even go to Yale historian Timothy Snyder, who, amongst others like Isabel Wilkerson, have explained the interrelationship between Nazi fascism and the US as a settler colonial project, right? Because Hitler was explicit about it. It was his settler colonial expansion was a war for Lebensraum, or living space, and he looked exactly to the United States as the project he wanted to emulate, right? But to understand that the core of this project was this fiction of a universal middle class, right? It was a fiction grounded in this idea of an Aryan race centered on nuclear middle class families and a Nazi version of the American dream. Again, that's not me, that's Yale historian Timothy Snyder. But then if we look at the United States and the reformist left today, certainly Bernie Sanders, calling to the same universal sort of middle class, it is entirely predicated on the perpetuation of settler colonial expansion because it is centered on the very same center of both Nazi fascism, German social democracy, and the settler project of America, which is this notion of nuclear middle class families all marching to the same American dream. And the center of these sort of liberal, progressive, democratic, socialist politics is no. There's living space for everyone. Everyone can benefit from the settler colony and the settler state, right? That is what they're saying. However, right, we just got done with the internationalism panel. We know that the fundamental global conditions that gave rise to the US middle class in the first place namely its privileged position at the end of World War II and what it's been able to usher in through this American century, right? Benefits that are fundamentally eroding around us, an acceleration to a multipolar world that we see accelerating around us right now, the benefits in the effect or the benefits of neoliberalism as it is continuing to accrue to the United States. All of these conditions are fundamentally changing, yet contemporary democratic socialist reformist politics, right? At least for the German Social Democratic Party, they had the largest political party against the Nazis. For us, we got Bernie Sanders, AOC, and the Squad to do what the SPD could not. And I think it speaks to, right, what Walter Benjamin referred to as a fundamental delusion that has been part and parcel to social democracy for the beginning, because its leadership can rise to positions of power by parroting the same universal middle-class talking points, and who ultimately reinforce this tendency towards social democracy, because it's what allows them to suck up all the oxygen in the room, the one to always be with books and speakers and all of these things having this institutional backing, always based on a perpetuation or the subsumption of revolutionary politics into something more palatable for themselves, namely social democracy. And I think what exists part and parcel to this is the elimination or the burying of the actual politics that existed in the German left against the Nazis in a sort of black hole, if you will, because as soon as you start exposing the politics that existed in the left in Germany against the Nazis, you expose not only the theoretical failures of the reformist left today, but you start to piece together this intergenerational history of how it was the case, or how it has been the case, that the lies and distortions that are told about this history become reproduced, right? So there's no better case of this than Noam Chomsky today, right? Repeatedly in interviews, he has blamed the German Communist Party for what led to Hitler's rise to power, right? It was the fact that by the July 1932 elections, after the German Communist Party started at the end of 1918, by the July 1932 elections, the SPD had become such a complete failure. It was by this time, all those years later, that the Communist Party first won more votes than the SPD, right? This is what Chomsky blames as the, what'd you say?
Got to start to wrap up. You're at 13.
This was the reason that Noam Chomsky blamed, whereas the entire reality, and you can go to leaders of the SPD like Franz Neumann, who blamed the SPD for not joining with the Communist Party in a united front for revolution, rather than what he referred to as the SPD's politics of lesser evilism, which inevitably, in his words, lead to semi-dictatorships on the path to fascism. Yeah, and I'll stop there. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Atlee. Sorry, I'm just trying to keep everyone to time so that we have plenty of time for discussion. So, Coco?
Hey, I'm Coco. You see him pronouns, and I was introduced previously, so I'll just get things started. So my presentation is going to be focusing on the, basically the kind of conditions that we face in the United States today, the historical causes for them, and why revolutionary politics and the strategy of revolution is, vital to the advance of the socialist movement, and why reformism can't actually give us, give us a path to socialism, particularly in relation to the history of the United States. So first, I'll start with a very broad overview of the development of the socialist movement. So in the mid to late 19th century was when socialism started to take root in the United States, and there were a variety of trends like a strong sort of utopian socialist bent of forming communes and escaping capitalist society, and basically trying to build a utopia on stolen indigenous land through collaborating with the kind of U.S. settler government. But there were also more militant, more revolutionary kinds of socialism that had already started to develop by that time. a more working class oriented socialism and Marxist socialism really took root after the outflux of German immigrants after the 1848 revolution was crushed in Germany. And many of these German immigrants soon brought Marxism to the working class of the United States. And quickly, by the end of the 19th century, there was a massive growth of a union movement, a labor movement, and socialists played a strong part in building that labor movement from the very first days of that struggle. And then in the early 20th century, we see the beginning of the Socialist Party, which ended up being numerically one of the largest organizations in US left history, and had a primary focus on electoralism, independent electoralism. So getting socialists elected, particularly to local office, but also with the runs of people like Eugene Debs for president. And these made significant inroads for socialist ideology, but were plagued by, the contradictions of a merger between revolutionary and reformist politics within the Socialist Party's organization. And this ultimately led to, after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the split between the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, which kind of put down on paper the distinction between reform and revolution in the United States, for the time since then. But the real thing I want to focus on is not giving a complete outline of the history of the left, but to point out that, the left has gone up and down in waves based on the actions of the US government and the actions of the participants of the left, their ideology, their strategy, etc. And throughout US history, we've seen this mix of repression and co-optation to deal with the rise of left-wing militancy. Most notably, in the 1920s, there was the first Red Scare where hundreds of communist and socialist activists were deported or imprisoned. And this really helped to break up a lot of the momentum of the left at that time. McCarthyism is obviously the most well-known example, with the blacklists and complete hounding out of revolutionaries from political life in the 1950s. And in the 1960s and 70s, the COINTELPRO was used to spy on and repress and even assassinate and imprison many of the most important revolutionary leaders of that time. So that's one aspect of it, is there's been a long chain of repression that's basically broken off some of the most militant leaders of the movement, whether it be from assassination, imprisonment, or through kicking them out of the workplace and kicking them out of the places where they could engage with the working class. And then on the other hand, you see this tendency, particularly of the Democratic Party historically, to co-opt and to take under their wing elements of the left in order to accommodate it and take away kind of the radical edge of its doctrine. And today we see that method of accommodation playing a primary role. In 2008, the financial crash really has produced the kind of conditions that we've seen in the United States since then. And that's led to the rising of a number of mass movements, such as Occupy Wall Street, the Black Lives Matter movement, Me Too, Standing Rock, and some labor activities, especially around Fight for 15 and organization of new unions. So these are the kind of conditions by 2016 that kind of gave a spark to the Bernie Sanders campaign. But I think the hard truth that we have to recognize is that most of the left fell right behind the Bernie Sanders campaign and its hopes of kind of reforming the Democratic Party or creating some sort of broader socialist movement. And now, after 6 years since that original campaign, I think we've seen a much more complicated phenomenon. We saw the rise of the Democratic Socialist of America, which is primarily a reformist organization and primarily has an emphasis on elections and running and supporting people within the Democratic Party. And I think this has been, a huge problem for the entire left. since the massive growth of the DSA and the overall stagnation or disorganization of the revolutionary left, socialism has been defined by these reformist elements, which don't have a clear strategic vision, to actually bring about socialism. But moreover, when they do have a clear strategic vision, it's a vision that, by definition, will never lead to socialism. I think this speaks to the overall weakness of the US socialist movement, that we continually get roped into these bourgeois campaigns and completely fall for the kind of liberal social democratic nexus which the Democratic Party uses to co-opt and disorganize those who are starting to question the legitimacy of the system. So I think the alternative that we can have today is a type of revolutionary politics. And, I think this is a very important distinction to make between reform and revolution. It's not solely about, revolutionaries are for overthrowing the system and reformists are for, changing the system. And we're both fighting for, the same goal, that is workers' control and socialism. In reality, the reformist method and the revolutionary method are worlds apart, even in the tactics and strategies that we pursue. So I think an important work to read is Lukács's Lenin, a study of the units of his thought, which gives a very clear explanation of what a revolutionary politics can look like in contrast to reformism. And he has this idea of the actuality of revolution. He makes this point that the thing that distinguished Lenin and the Bolsheviks at that time was they actually, created a sort of nexus between, the revolutionary outlook and the day-to-day work that they were involved in, which was not common in the socialist movement at that time. Like the German Social Democratic Party, the German Social Democratic Party really created this distinction between, like, we're organizing for reforms today. The movement is everything and the end is nothing. Socialism is nothing, the movement is everything, that kind of thing. And ultimately, they would have at their private meetings talk about, like how great socialism will be. But in reality, their day-to-day work had nothing to do with the vision of bringing about a revolution or bringing about socialism. So there becomes this huge disjuncture between, the goal and how we're actually fighting for it. So to get very concrete about this, I think we need to recognize the particular situation we're in the United States today, that, the working class, the unions, and the organizations of the left have been disorganized for 40 years since, the 1960s and 1970s movements. And that's created a situation where the socialist movement doesn't have much of a place to take root on a mass level. The precondition for a mass socialist movement that can actually, fight for the kind of things that we want to fight for, not just a reform of the Democratic Party or a certain, set of watered down demands. The precondition of that is mass organizations of the working class, like unions, like community organizations, and other things that can bring the working class into political life. The reason the German Social Democratic Party, the Bolsheviks, all of these organizations of the past, the Chinese Communist Party, etc., could actually reach a mass audience is because the working class was already organized on this basic level. So revolutionaries need to integrate themselves into these things. So if we recognize the overall weakness of this particular moment, I think that informs the kind of tasks that we need to pursue. I think the kind of insight that revolutionary politics and this idea of the actuality of the revolution can give us is that, we need to change that situation of the disorganization of the working class. So I think we need to proceed on, what was that?
You're at 10 minutes?
Okay, yeah, we need to proceed along two lines. And the first line is part of what we're doing with this conference, which is to, reorganize the scattered layers of revolutionaries across the country into a principled organization that can act together, can act at local and national levels to, put forward and develop revolutionary politics and bring people into, the Marxist movement in general. But on another level, I think we need to be very concerned with how we helped to organize the organic energy of the working class in the United States. You know, with the George Floyd rebellions in 2020, I think it showed how much militancy and how much, you know, desire for revolutionary and sweeping changes there is among the US working class. But that movement was never, you know, guided into any types of organizations. You know, organizations were in fact very hard to find in these movements. And because of that, the sentiments of the masses were able to be redirected or completely, you know, erased in that. So, you know, the liberals co-opted and repressed that movement at that time, and it never led to a concretization of any mass organizations to work with. So, you know, I think we need to proceed along those two lines, which is to help reorganize the working class, whether that be in unions or community organizations on that basic level, while also organizing an organization of revolutionaries that can act within that. And I think there's good evidence in the past, including in the United States context, that the concerted organization of revolutionaries can help rebuild or build for the first time these kind of organizations that can act as the basic line of defense for the working class. The final thing I'll say, I'd love to get to more, is that, you know, I think electoralism is a huge problem for the US left, and particularly this Democratic Party electoralism, which actively leads to the co-optation of our movement. I think we need to severely criticize all of the politicians that, you know, run under the socialist banner today, while they do things like support US military funding, while they, you know, oppose the liberation of Palestine, while they completely give up their fight for even the most basic reforms they advocate. Instead, I think we need to primarily be focused on the organization of, you know, this radical energy that has no place to go in the United States. The Democratic Party is the enemy of that mass sentiment. So we need to help build that kind of alternative. And the vast majority of the activity will be outside of elections. You know, I think there are some role for elections, but it has to be under very strict, you know, very strict sorts of controls and for a very strict purpose. We're not going to recompose and rebuild the US working class through just calling for universal health care and running on the Democratic Party ballot line. In fact, that's the best way to never have universal health care happen, let alone a socialist revolution. We need an independent and revolutionary vision, an independent revolutionary organization, and a focus on organizing the masses of the working class in a broad sense. And that's why I think it's so important that, you know, we're here today and we're continuing to try to rebuild the revolutionary left. Without, you know, the kind of activity of every single person on this call and all the people that, you know, have our kind of vision, we can't do anything. You know, we need to get organized together and work towards our common goals. Otherwise, you know, this kind of social democratic trend will fall straight back into liberalism and disenchant the working class for a generation. You know, the stakes are extremely high, particularly today. So it's necessary that we continue to fight, necessary that we continue to organize. And I hope that we can all do that together moving forward. Thank you.